Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Global Dialogues on Anti-Corruption webinar. My name is Yafeng Zhang. I'm associate professor at the School of Public Affairs and Administration, Rutgers University. I'm the director of Rutgers Institute on Anti-Corruption Studies. The Global Dialogues on Anti-Corruption webinar series is a monthly event. We invite globally distinguished scholars and experts to speak at the webinars based on their research and expertise. Their presentations will help us better understand the issues of corruption and as well as anti-corruption efforts with a global perspective. Today we are so honored to have Dr. Dan Feldman to speak to us on the Inspector General system in terms of cultural constraints. Dr. Dan Feldman is a professor of public management at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has written 6 books and many articles on American law and government. He is a co-author of the book, The Art of the Watchdog, Fighting Fraud, Waste, Abuse, and Corruption in Government, published in 2014 by SUNY Press. Most recently, he published the book, Administrative Law, The Sources and Limits of Government Agency Power, published with SAGE. Professor Feldman majored in economics at Columbia College and took his law degree at Harvard University, where he was awarded the Wilson Prize for Contract Negotiation and Drafting. Professor Dan Feldman has been an investigative counsel to a committee of the New York State Legislature, senior staff member to the New York State Attorney General, special counsel for law and policy to the New York State Comptroller, and the chair of the Assembly Committee on Corruption. With those capacities, Professor Dan Feldman has led significant investigations resulting in programmatic reforms and criminal convictions. He investigated and corrected prison abuses and led efforts to repeal the Rockefeller drug laws. Well, audience, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And during the webinar, you can type in your questions in the chat box and send out. Dr. Feldman will answer the questions at the end. So, welcome again, and let me give the floor to Dr. Feldman. Please enjoy. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me and for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the system the major system that the United States has developed for fighting corruption and some other things, which I'm going to talk about, and also giving me the opportunity to talk about how I think that system might be adapted to other cultures, other countries. Let me say that what I'm going to talk about reflects some evolution, and relatively recent evolution in my own thinking. About 3 years ago, I gave a talk at the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity at Columbia University, in which I was expressing my own frustration with certain aspects of the Inspector General role that I thought were not going well, that I thought were inadequately pursued and accomplished here in the United States. However, as I began to think more about the subject, let me say, not only I called on the IGs, on the inspectors general, to take on a somewhat different role when I published an article to that effect and so forth, obviously to no avail. And I began to accept the fact that the political culture of the United States made it very unlikely that that aspect of the inspector general role would be enhanced or pursued with more vigor. I'll explain what I mean in the main course of my presentation. But I also, that was the bad news. The good news is that the IG model could be adapted in other countries, and the political cultures of different countries will help different aspects of the job. Let me explain what I'm talking about. There's something called the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. That's kind of a consortium or a group. It's the organizing body of United States Federal Inspectors General that was created by the 2008 amendments to the original 1978 Inspector General Act, which the original act set up this IG system, Inspector General system, where we have people in essentially each major federal agency whose job it is to be watchdogs, let's say, fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, but also, let me get to the right slide here if I can work the technology. Yeah, fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, but also, and this is the point I was hinting at before, also finding ways to enhance effectiveness and efficiency. Now, if the Council of the Inspector General on Integrity and Efficiency defines the Inspector General role that way, I think we can take it as a pretty firm notion that that is what they should be doing. And for purposes of this discussion, I want to accept that definition as normative. That is, I believe that that is the proper role of Inspectors General. But what I'm about to explain is that while the culture of the United States supports and enhances that first part of the role, the combating waste, fraud, and abuse, it actually hinders, impairs, limits the effectiveness of IGs in the second respect, in terms of enhancing effectiveness and efficiency. Let me go into more detail of what I mean. Political cultures in different countries obviously vary. On the slide, you can see that in some other countries, even the basic function of the Inspector General differs in widely varying ways, reflecting the cultures of those countries. So what an IG does, even how the IG role is defined, depends on the specific culture in which it's operating. One characteristic of the United States that is very deeply rooted is distrust of government. Now, in 1978, when the Federal Inspector General Act was first passed by Congress, it created the system of across federal agencies. One of the goals of the act was to increase public trust in government. If you followed any of the polling on this subject, you know that that didn't work. That didn't happen. In those days, and I don't have the figure in front of me, but I think surveys in those days, 1978 or thereabouts, recorded or reported public trust in federal government at fairly high levels, at least in the 60s or 70s percentages. You can see that the public trust in government, in fact, not only has not increased, it has significantly declined in the United States in that time period. However, I have to say that in some ways, distrust of government in the United States has very deep historical roots. After all, we are a nation that was born out of rebellion against the central government, the central English government. And so distrust, I don't know why this is the wrong slide. Let me go back. Distrust of government is kind of a core feature of American history, and is built into the Constitution in the sense of checks and balances that each institution of the executive branch, the legislative branch, the public didn't trust any part of government to exercise complete power. So we set up, our Constitution reflects in a way that deep-seated distrust of central government power. This distrust allows the IGs to have a fairly robust degree of independence. That is, when Congress enacted the IG Act in 1978, as I mentioned, it very purposely gave IGs powers that the executive branch, in which the IGs were placed, had limited ability to constrict or constrain or to stop IGs from doing their investigations. The law itself says while the IG's supervisor could be a cabinet secretary or head of a major agency, quote, supervises its inspector general, but that's pretty nominal. That supervisor is not allowed to, quote, prevent or prohibit the IG from initiating, carrying out, or completing any audit or investigation, with a couple of exceptions that I wouldn't call them minor exceptions, but they're very limited exceptions. National security interests, a couple of other things. By and large, when an inspector general, let's say you have an inspector general in Department of Transportation, the Secretary of Transportation cannot stop that IG from subpoenaing any documents in accessing, grabbing any documents in that agency that the IG needs to look at. The IG can talk to anyone in the agency who's willing to talk to the IG. The head of the agency cannot stop the IG from doing these things. So this creates a significant amount of independence, and that's a good thing. This is a way in which that distrust of government that's not only built into the Constitution, but really is kind of a feature of the American political culture generally. That kind of distrust helps the IG in the compliance role and the catching bad guys part of their role of inspector general, and that's significant, and I appreciate that, and I reward and I recognize and very much approve of that. For even the president appoints many of these IGs, but the president cannot fire an IG unless the president explains why to Congress. So, if the real reason the president is firing the IG is because the IG is unearthing information that's embarrassing to the administration, and that's why the president wants to get rid of the IG, the president himself or herself may undergo some serious embarrassment trying to explain that to Congress. So IGs exercise real independence in a lot, there's no such thing as total independence, but real independence in a lot of important ways. If that weren't the case, they really wouldn't be able to expose bad behavior and do things that report to Congress in a way, and Congress and the press, in a way that has in fact resulted in the removal of incompetent or corrupt agency heads and so on and so forth. The Government Accountability Office, which in a way competes with IGs as a watchdog and therefore could be expected to be maybe a little skeptical about the IG performance, in fact has reported that IGs have saved American taxpayers billions of dollars, $18 saved for every dollar spent, which resulted in thousands of criminal indictments and gotten rid of a good number of bad contractors, although I'm going to have more to say about that later. It's not enough in that last regard. But obviously have done a lot of important things. If you look at cultures in which there is less independence, clearly the watchdog role is much, much less effective. It has been reported that individuals in African countries whose assignment has been to fight corruption often face serious death threats and on occasion have actually been assassinated. And that's going to make for a lot fewer people willing to do that kind of a job. There are other nations, there's a Southeast Asian nation recently, for example, where the anti-corruption official wasn't assassinated, but was incarcerated, was put in prison in response to their watchdog role. So those kinds of disincentives, and death and incarceration, pretty strong disincentives, obviously limit the degree to which people in an inspector general type of role will even be willing to take on that role, or will act with energy and effectiveness in pursuing corruption because they'll be afraid. So that's the good in the United States. Our culture of distrust of government supports IGs pursuing bad guys. But here's the downside. Here's the problem. The public loves this. It feeds into and reinforces the distrust of government that is typically American anyway. You know, aha, they caught another government guy stealing or whatever. So the incentives from the public, from Congress, from the press, every time an inspector general catches some wrongdoer, they get great press and everybody loves it. They get more applause, and so that's incentive for doing more of that. But it is overwhelmingly likely that this doesn't increase trust in government. All these press reports about, another dishonest person in government got caught. If anything, this is likely to decrease trust in government. And how does that play out? That means that the public is less willing to pay taxes, as I think you all know. In the past 40 years, the American public has rebelled against tax increases on a broad scale. That is, they still like their individual programs, but overall, their message to Congress is, we don't want to pay more taxes. So funding declines. When I say funding declines, understand what that means. That means agencies don't get enough money to do the job, to fulfill the mission for which they were created. Now, when people go into government because they want to serve the public, and over time they find that they don't have the resources, the tools, the ability to do that, inevitably morale will decline. And I'm not saying this would be true of most people working in government, certainly is not, but it will increase the likelihood that some people will say, all right, well, I can't really do what I came to do, let me at least take care of myself. And as bureaucrats shift as there's a pressure on them in this manner to shift to self-interest, some of them will do wrong things. And so you'll have more bad guys, so to speak, and you'll have inspectors general catching more bad guys and getting more good press for doing this, and further feeding this cycle of distrust. And then you just repeat the thing all over again. So there's still less funding, still less capacity, still less ability to do the job. Remember, the second piece of the IG role, as the Council of Inspector General defined it, is capacity building, is efficiency and effectiveness, promoting efficiency and effectiveness. That usually costs money. And so in that part of they're really discouraged from doing that part of the role. Why? Because when they go to Congress and ask for more money, almost invariably Congress doesn't want to hear that. The public doesn't like it. Nobody likes it. So IGs they may ask for more money, but they're going to get discouraged in trying to do that, trying to build capacity in agencies. One agency had once said he had more people watching than doing. I'm sure it's an exaggeration, but that reflects this process that I'm talking about. The Veterans Administration scandal of a few years ago was really, in a way, a perfect illustration. The big scandal was that the bureaucrats in the Veterans Administration had hidden the fact that veterans were facing delays in getting medical treatment. That was the big scandal? That the bureaucrats altered the files, altered the records so that people couldn't tell that veterans weren't getting medical treatment as quickly as they needed it? Wasn't the real scandal that the VA didn't have enough doctors to give them the medical care they needed? Isn't that a much bigger scandal? But no, the way this thing gets couched in the American culture is, the bad thing is these bad bureaucrats hiding the truth. No, the bad thing was the American public not allowing Congress to fund this in a manner that provided adequate medical care. But the culture here skews this, distorts this in that manner. By the way, when Congress finally did, provide a little more money, I'll get to this point later, what they ended up doing was not increasing doctors on the federal payroll, but contracting out to the private sector, because distrust of government is such that, well, it's okay to spend more money on the private sector, but not on government. The entrepreneurial approach, this preference for the private sector, has done two things. One, it's decreased availability of funding for government work. Two, it has increased the likelihood of contracting out, even when contracting out is inappropriate. We'll talk about that in a bit, too. And of course, this influences the work of IGs. This slide, I guess, kind of repeats the point I made earlier. While it is true that the public actually opposes budget cuts to particular government agencies, still they constantly reinforce the message that taxes are too high, and so the popular message is federal government budget needs to be shrunk down to size, and that's the pressure that I'm talking about. And so the agencies don't get the support they really need. What may astonish some of our listeners is that federal government employment has actually decreased from the Reagan administration in the 1980s to the Obama administration in the second decade of the 2000s. Yes, the federal budget has increased, but a large, substantial explanation of that increase in the federal budget is outsourcing to the private sector of what had been government responsibilities. So again, distrust of government is the pervading theme here. And the results of this excessive outsourcing, I know some of it. Privately run correctional facilities have been a horrible mess. A number of years ago, the Challenger spacecraft, which exploded and killed people on it, an enormous American tragedy, resulted in large part from contracting out parts of the construction of the spacecraft to the private sector that was cost-cutting. The killing of civilians by Blackwater private security costs, for which the American taxpayer paid enormous amounts of money, not only cost the United States money, but reputation and lives, and and it fed into the anti-American feeling in the Middle East that has contributed to the rise of ISIS. There's an occasional exception. There's a very good exception. I was happy to see it, but it was very late and rather unusual. Just this year, in fact, only a few months ago, the Inspector General for the Department of Justice finally reported on the slide says deficiencies is putting it mildly, the disastrous operation of private prisons that the federal government has given money to incarcerate people. And the IG finally said, well, this is really not worked very well. And the Justice Department, in response, did at long last reduce reliance on such contractors. But that's the rare exception. Overwhelmingly, this vastly excessive outsourcing to the private sector goes on with impunity, without significant public criticism. And I have to attribute that to the bias in favor of the private sector in this country, and that general distrust from government. Now, that's the bad news in the United States, which as I said, I had made some vain attempts to try to change. But I've come to recognize that this aspect of American culture is so strong and so deep-rooted that the likelihood of changing it, at least in the near future, is pretty small. That's the bad news. The good news is that the cultures of other countries may, in fact, promote that aspect of an IG role. And I'm going to use as an example China, and I'm selecting China because I had the privilege of presenting some of these thoughts in China, in Beijing at Renmin University a few months ago. And so I've been doing a little research and thinking about what an IG system might look like were it, for example, to be established in China. And I come to the conclusion that China is a pretty good illustration of how some kind of IG system might operate usefully there. Trust in central government in China is quite high, according to very reliable surveys. The Harvard Kennedy School and Horizon Market Research did a survey in 2011 in which they found that satisfaction with the central government is quite high, as high, really over 90% in 2011. And another survey taken only a few years before that, in 2008, by Texas A&M University, in conjunction with Beijing University, found that the modal, quote, I'm quoting, the modal Chinese citizen appears fully satisfied with national government performance. For those scholars of Chinese government, a little footnote, trust in local governments in China is not as high. It's still more than the majority, but it's lower. But trust in central government is quite high. In addition, of course, there is no, unlike the United States, in sharp contrast to the United States, there's no serious tension between the legislative and executive branches. So that flips it around. That is, the tension between the executive and legislative branches in the United States helps give IGs independence that strengthens their role in compliance monitoring and catching bad guys, because the political allies of the bad guys can't stop them. On the other hand, the distrust in government in the United States supports that compliance monitoring role. But on the other hand, the distrust of government in the United States hurts the capacity building role. And it's precisely the opposite in China, so that it is not all that likely that an IG system would add much to the anti-corruption efforts in China in regard to, quote, bad guys who have close allies at the top of the Chinese political system. Right now, the disciplinary committee of the Communist Chinese Party has in fact been, as many of you may know, has in fact been very energetic in fighting corruption. But skeptics believe that it is, shall we say, more effective in fighting corruption among people who are not particularly close with the leadership, or whom the leadership is no longer close with. Besides that, in any authoritarian one-party state, independence from political control by political superiors is just not something one is likely to see. On the other hand, because there is significant level of trust in China, an IG, an Inspector General in China, would not face the other problem that American IGs face. That is, if an Inspector General in China said, this agency really is not able to achieve effectiveness in its operation because it doesn't have adequate support, it doesn't have the funding it needs for, I don't know, could be an information technology system, it could be staff, it could be, who knows, trucks and vehicles, whatever. It doesn't have the hard or soft infrastructure support it needs. In China, you're not going to get sort of a knee-jerk response of, oh, no, we can't spend any more money. That means more taxes, more money for government. We don't like that. You won't get that response. And state control is not in any way violative. It's not in any way inconsistent with the public point of view or ideology of China. That American instinct that says, oh, the private sector is better, isn't dominant in China. The dominant ethos, as I said in the slide, continues to reserve a place of honor for state control. So you are not likely to get that kind of reflexive antagonism or antipathy to increased government spending. So if an IG in China finds that a government agency can't do what it's supposed to do because it doesn't have enough funding, at least you're not going to get that ideologically based resistance or say, oh no, well, if we're going to spend money, it has to go to the private sector. I suppose one might think that the IG in China, if they're suggesting something that is at odds, that is different from the initial budget that their political superiors set forth, they might be overruled in that regard as well. But I think that is an error. I think that it's a little more. The problem is more sophisticated than that. In any large government, and China's as in the United States, in China as in the United States, the government is very, very large. The bureaucracy is very, very big. Government is responsible for and required to do a great many different things, and it's really not possible for the political leadership to keep track of everything. In fact, it's very far from possible. No large modern government can possibly operate without a very large bureaucracy that is doing more than the central government can keep track of on its own. So that in the United States, for example, one inspector general said, with respect to one very small piece, relatively small piece of American government, he said, unless there is an IG, an inspector general, audit or investigation, or the granting agency dedicates resources to collect and analyze accounting information from the recipient, the government and taxpayers are virtually in the dark regarding how grant funds were actually used. Understand the significance of this. The use of grant funds is one very small piece of what American government does, a tiny piece. And even that is so information rich, is so complex, that Congress, the president, the agency head, is not going to have any idea of really what's going on unless an inspector general tells them. Well, if it's true of that little narrow piece of government, it's far more true of the vast range of responsibilities that government bureaucracy, whether in China or the United States, has to deal with. And so it's not that the IG, that the central, if an IG in China said, this needs more attention, this needs more funding, this needs more resources, and so forth, it's not like the central government is going to say, oh, well, this is different from what we said originally, we're not going to go along with that. This information will be valuable to central government. It will help them accomplish the very goals that they themselves want to accomplish. And so an IG in this respect can make government more effective, more efficient. And the point is that in a culture like China, it can play that role far more effectively than it plays that role in the United States. So to summarize my vision of how an IG system would work in China, by the way, I didn't mean to say that the compliance monitoring part, the catching bad guys part, wouldn't be effective at all. It probably would be somewhat effective, but they're probably not as effective as in the United States. On the other hand, the capacity building and the performance monitoring part of the role, given the Chinese culture, an IG in China would probably be far more effective than in the United States. So that's really the good news, that there are, if you model an IG system in other cultures, it may not be as effective in some respects as the IG system in the United States, but it might well be more effective than the IG system in the United States in other respects. I don't mean to be deeply negative about the IG system in the United States either. As I said earlier, certainly the IG system saves American taxpayers enormous amounts of money every year. And again, even on the performance monitoring, capacity building side, it's not entirely without effect. I mentioned the IG report on private contracting of prisons that came out recently that was quite effective. So it's not entirely without its effectiveness even on the performance monitoring capacity building side. But the United States culture will tend to enhance the compliance monitoring side and will tend to limit, constrain, and weaken the performance monitoring capacity building side. So it's a mixed picture. It's by no means all bad. I still kind of hope we can strengthen the performance monitoring capacity building side in the United States as well. But overall, I think that's the picture. And at this point, I hope we have some questions to answer, because that's my presentation. Thank you. Uh-oh, I can't hear you at this end. I can no longer hear you.
Okay. Okay, I realized. So right now you should be able to hear me. Yes? Hello?
I can hear you. Yes, we hear you now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much for the great presentation. Very knowledgeable, very informative, and I like the part. You compare the IG system of US with the system of China. So very interesting perspectives. But I think some of the audience, from the audience, some of them students may not be familiar with the IG system in the US. Can you give a brief introduction of the IG system in the US? For example, it's with the executive branch and appointed by president, right? But the president cannot file the IGs. But are there any local branches of IGs in the U.S. And also at the state level, at the local level? Do we have offices? How it works?
Okay, there are several questions there. So before you ask any more questions, let me. I don't know what that noise was, but if we could... Oh, we're getting feedback. Could you deal with that in some way technically? All right. As I tried to say, that there are a couple of questions there, so let me respond to those two at least two questions before we get any more. First, let me explain a little bit more about the federal IG system. The Inspector General has each federal Inspector General has two major roles. One is investigations, the other is audits. Investigations are, as you might expect, efforts that are sparked by suspicions, by allegations of wrongdoing by someone in or working for or in contract with a federal agency. Audits are more a systemic review. So an auditor is supposed to come to a system without any preconception that something's going wrong, but just analyze where the vulnerabilities are. In other words, where are the weaknesses of this system? In what ways can it be exploited by corruption, for example? Let's take, Medicare and Medicaid. Could you have Medicaid mills that create false billing for medical services that were not really provided, and therefore essentially are stealing federal taxpayer dollars that are supposed to be going to pay for real medical services? So the Inspector General is supposed to take on both roles, figure out where the system is vulnerable to abuse, and recommend changes that will end those vulnerabilities, and also investigate examples or illustrations or allegations of possible wrongdoing by individuals. And this Congress created this system in 1978. There were, I believe, 2 inspectors general that were created in 76, but the IG Act that set up the Federal Inspector General system was enacted in 1978. And at the time, I believe it established 13 inspectors general. By now, there are about 70 inspectors general covering virtually every federal agency. Many of them, I think 30 of them, directly appointed by the president, and about the rest appointed by agency heads. The president can fire an IG. The question wasn't phrased exactly correctly, but only if the president explains to Congress why. And if the president doesn't have a good explanation, that, as I said, could be quite an embarrassing exercise for the president. The second question had to do with state and local IGs. And yes, not every state has an inspector general, but many do. These were established separately at the state level. There are some local inspectors general as well. There are several in Florida. There were some in some other states. New York has a state inspector general, but we also have inspectors general at, for example, the Port Authority, which is a bi-state agency authority, actually, in New York. New York City has what's called the Department of Department of Investigations, which actually sends out inspectors general to virtually every New York City agency. So yes, there are state and local inspectors general as well. Now, I did see another post from a moment ago. I saw something pop up with another question, but it popped up and then disappeared. So if you could tell me what that new question is, I'll try to respond to it. Now, again, I do not hear you. You've gone mute again.
Okay. Let me try if I do this. Can you see the question? I can send you.
Public distrust and privatization. If you leave the question up, I need more time to read it. It popped up for a moment and disappeared.
Okay. Okay. So I can read for you the question. The question is, could you tell me the relationship between public distrust and privatization, and between public trust and contracting out? That's one of the questions.
Yes. Yes. The point there. Now, if you can mute yourself again, the feedback is bad. I know you have to go back and forth, muting and unmuting, but the feedback again. The relationship is that it is distrust of government, but that because there's greater trust of the private sector, the result is that instead of spending more money on having services performed by the government instead enters into contracts with private organizations to provide that same service. So, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, rather than have the military provide, our American military, the United States Armed Forces, provide security for Department of State and for other services, we didn't do that. We hired something called Blackwater Services, which was a private organization, to provide that security. They were not bound by the same rules that constrain public agencies. They didn't have the military discipline that the Defense Department has. They were not accountable in the same way. And later it came out that they were often trigger happy, they're grossly irresponsible, killed Iraqi civilians for no good reason. But the instinct of the American taxpayer is, oh, that's the private sector. They're much better than government. We trust them. We don't trust the government. And so Congress allows this, and the agencies do it. And they say, oh, well, we won't have the government agency do it. We'll have the private sector do it at enormous expense. So distrust of government plays out in terms of excessive. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any outsourcing and private contracting. Of course, there should be some. but it can be excessive, and that's explained by the fact that if you think about the politics of it, who is going to get these contracts? Not necessarily the company that does the work best, more likely the company that's most effective in lobbying, in persuading the government that they should get the contract. How do they persuade the government? Well, it's possible that they give campaign contributions. It's also possible they spend a lot of time lobbying. So it's not who will do the job best, it's who's best at getting the contract. And because they are not bound by the laws that do bind and constrain American agents, government agencies, this can be very problematic. As I said, the rare exception of an IG successfully pointing out the weaknesses of outsourcing was Justice Department IG Horowitz's report exposing the horrendous failures of the private prison system, which quite recently has gotten the Justice Department to reduce its reliance on that private sector. The question is an IG responsible for monitoring these private sector contracts? And the answer is yes, they certainly can be. It is part of their mandate, but because they rarely get support when they do that, in the United States there's a disincentive for them to pursue that part of their role. Please understand that you can't. It's not like the IG is required to do all these. That's not possible. The IG no IG has unlimited staff or time or funding. So the IG has to choose among its various responsibilities. And because IGs get support and applause and positive incentives far more for compliance monitoring, IG catching bad guys, than they do for pointing out the weaknesses of outsourcing or the inadequacies of funding, naturally they're going to tend more to the side of the job that is compliance monitoring. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for the answer. We have a related question, which came from Gigi. He or she asks, could you explain if the IG is also in charge of feeding investigations for contracted out service?
I think I responded to that question a moment ago because I saw it popped up on the screen. And as I said, responsible is a strange way of putting it. We're getting the feedback again. Responsible for is an odd way of putting it because the IG cannot. Could you mute yourself again, please? The IG cannot possibly do everything that it would like to do. When you say is responsible for it, the IG can do those things, but since an IG cannot possibly do everything that it's required to do, it doesn't have unlimited staff or funding or time, IGs will tend to do what they get positive reinforcement for doing, which is compliance monitoring. So yes, an IG can audit and investigate the private sector when it is in contract with government agency, but IGs rarely will get a good response for doing that because of this instinctive distrust of government and trust of the private sector. So naturally, they will tend to do more compliance monitoring, that is, catching bad guys. All right, now you have to unmute yourself. I mean, you have to mute yourself. Unmute yourself so we hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dan. I have a question. Seems the work of IG overlaps to some degree with the work of FBI. What's the relationship between two agencies? I mean, between the IG system and FBI?
Very good question.
Oh, thank you.
The IGs often refer cases to the FBI, so that many FBI investigations are initiated by referrals they get from inspectors general. However, the FBI has a broad range of responsibilities. The FBI pursues many, many crimes that have nothing to do with government agencies. The FBI, as part of the Department of Justice, does investigations that support and underlie any kind of prosecution that a U.S. attorney will pursue. Whenever a U.S. attorney goes to court with a criminal prosecution, they may well be relying on the FBI investigation. That is, the vast majority of prosecutions have nothing to do with government agencies. The inspectors general, their role is only with respect to the activities of government. Now, those activities could include contractual relationships with the private sector, but unless there is some kind of government agency nexus, the IG is not, that's outside the jurisdiction of the IG.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I think, let's see if, if we have other questions. If we don't. Thank you so much, Professor Feldman. Very good, very interesting presentation. I think I learned a lot from your presentation, and we will post your presentation on our website. Maybe in the future, people will have questions, and we may collect the questions and discuss in the future. So thank you again for the opportunity for us to learn from you, and we keep in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.